creation. And as I said, I like with the song that we just sang, heaven above in softer blue, earth around is softer green. Something lives in every hue Christless eyes have never seen. Well, this psalmist clearly was enamored with creation. Possibly he went out and looked around the creation at night. There's just something about stargazing that makes people think of the awesomeness of the universe. Or he got up in the morning and he saw the water flowing, the birds chirping, the cattle feeding, all those different things, which just shows the glory of God. I like this song that we sang, Earth Around and Sweeter Green, especially in the springtime when the buds are starting to come out a little bit on the trees, and it's warm enough to walk outside. And I think of that psalm, especially when I think of the birds and so forth in the trees and all the ecosystems and the systems that are going around us. And God is a God of timing and systems, and you see that in his creation, and we'll be talking about that. So we see that, I like what Warren Wiersbe says, whether it's the scientist uses a telescope, the microscope, or the X-ray, he beholds the wonders of God's creation. And of course, God's creation was marred by man's sin, and yet, in spite of all the problems, and we know that in Romans 8:18 through 23, it tells us that the whole creation groans until now, and yet we see that in spite of it all, there's a beauty. There's a beauty to God's creation. So we'll begin, and since this is a longer one, we'll try to divide it up into sections. And so let's read the first 13 verses. He said, "Bless the Lord, O my soul." Where did we hear that before? In Psalm 102. So we see that the theme is going on. "Bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord my God, you are very great. You are clothed with honor and majesty, who covers yourself with light as with a garment, who stretch out the heavens like a curtain. He lays the beams of his upper chambers in the waters, who makes the clouds his chariot, who walks on the wings of the wind. He makes the angels spirits. He ministers a flame of fire. You who laid the foundations of the earth so that it should not be moved forever. You've covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke, they fled. As at the voice of your thunder, they hastened away. They went up over the mountains. They went down into the valleys to a place which you founded for them. You have set a boundary that they may not pass over, that they may not return to cover the earth. He sends the springs in the valleys. They flow among the hills. They drink to they give drink to every beast of the field. The wild donkeys quench their thirst. By them the birds of the heavens have their home. They sing among the branches. The waters, the hills, he waters the hills from his upper chambers. The earth is satisfied with the fruit of your works. So we see, first of all, we see God's revelation in creation. Obviously, this man believes, the psalmist believes in the Genesis account of creation, because he talks about light and he talks about the animal kingdoms. He talks about the various systems that God has used to make up the earth and to make up his creation. So first of all, we see he begins the psalm with both in the very beginning and the end of the psalm, he praises God for his salvation, for his creation. And we see, of course, bless the Lord, O my soul. And we saw that in Psalm 103. We see it in Psalm 104, both the beginning and the end of both of those psalms. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless his holy name. Now notice how he characterizes God in the first 4 verses of this. He says, "O Lord, my God." So that establishes the relationship. He's a person who accepts our Lord, and as a result, he's talking about that something lives in every hue Christless eyes have never seen. Well, he sees the hues, the colors of God, because he's a man who lives in fear of the Lord, and of course is looking forward to the Messiah. And so we see that he is clothed with honor and majesty. Now, of course, God is spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. So we don't worship we don't worship the sun, moon, and stars, but we realize that God made them, and that's what he shows us. In fact, Psalm 19:1 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament," that's the earth, "shows his handiwork." And so he's looking around, the heavens above is softer blue, earth around is sweeter green. And so he's looking at all this, and he sees that, the clothing of God, if you want to call it that. You can't see God, but you see what he has made. And then he talks about he's covered with light. And of course, in 1 John 1, verse 5, it says, "God is light, and in him is no darkness at all." And of course, God reveals himself through his light, through the light of his glory. Moses just asked God to show him the fringe of his garment. And of course, it was so bright that man couldn't look even upon the reflection of God upon Moses' face. And so we see that he's clothed, he's covered. That word covered now is going to come up several times, or blanketed, or whatever. The idea there is Psalm 1, verse 1 and 2 tells us that he made the waters, and he brooded upon the face of the waters. That is the idea. He really concentrated on life. I mean, he brooded. In fact, he was concentrating on life. And whether you go down to the Titanic and they find now that there's all kinds of life down there, or you go up to the very top of Mount Everest, there's just all kinds of organisms. And I was listening to some guy on the radio the other day on the was it WLUV or whatever, but he was talking about how that, back when I was in school, as recently as, just a few years ago, but I wish, but they said, the simple cell, you just had the cell and you had a couple of components of the cell. Now they're finding that each cell, and he called them little engines, that they have engines inside those cells that are functioning and that are working and doing different works within the cells. And that's where we get our DNA. And of course, DNA was just discovered or figured out within the last 30, 40, 50 years. And of course, each component, each cell is different, but different in your body. And yet, my cells are totally different. All I need is 2 or 3 cells, and they can detect whether it's me or you. I mean, that's how unique we're made. And he came up with some number over 1 trillion cells that we have in our bodies. And so we are that's just us. That's just one person. So we got life upon life. We've got, I think, now I forget, I should have written it down. So I think we've got 11 major systems within our bodies. And then we got a timer. We got a heart. And if that heart gets out of system, then you have to have that pacemaker put in for the system. So that's why I've said many times that God is a God of his creation anyway. He's a God that has made timing and systems. Timing and systems. Things all work together for good to them that love him. But then he also says, in him all things consist. And so everything consists in God's timing. And after all, he's made everything beautiful. How? In his time. So we see now that God is covered. He's brooded. He's concentrated the world. And of course, light gives life. And so he's constructed it that way. And then he talks about his mobility. Just notice the flowering words that he uses in verse 3. For my days are, excuse me, he says in verse 3, he lays the he lays the beams of his upper chambers in waters. Now, his upper chambers, of course, are we talking about the atmosphere now? He makes the clouds his chariot. Now, very flamboyant. But, when you think of a chariot, what did Joseph get once he was pronounced to be royal? A chariot. And, of course, what did the king ride in? A royal chariot. And here we have the idea of God. And, of course, a chariot for a king didn't have to be a war chariot. We think of the Ethiopian eunuch probably wasn't riding in a war chariot. He was probably riding in more of a palace, like an ancient Winnebago, or really a nice place, because we know that Philip crawled right up there and talked to him in that chariot. But he rides. Notice the flamboyant terms he uses. The idea is that he is transcendent. He is overall. And we saw last week his throne is into heaven and he rules over all. But he's transcendent. He walks on the wings of the wind. And of course he controls the winds. But you think about now that he's making God above it all. He makes the angels, spirits, his ministers, a flame of fire. So even the angels, he is in control of everything. The spirit world, and of course, it's interesting how he goes from the clouds to wind to spirits. And of course, the word in the Greek for spirit is pneuma or pneuma, where we get the word pneumonia, but it's the idea of wind. And so the Greeks thought of wind as spirits. But here we see, and this is Hebrew, of course, but the angels are spirits. And so just a natural progression there of the spirit world. God's over it all. He rides in his chariot over it all. And of course, he makes them his ministers. Like the Ethiopian eunuch had people with him as his ministers. Well, God's got a whole few million ministers, and of course, and we see them many times with flames of fire. So we see he reveals himself in his majesty, or God reveals his majesty to us. The wind, the stars, everything about God. Just that song, "Oh Lord my God, I feel the gentle breeze." There again. We think of a lot of songs that talk about God's creation. So the verse 3 verses or 4 verses, we see that God's transcendency, as well as that he's clothed, he's covered. He is, he reveals himself through these things, even though we don't see them or can't fathom them. I looked at clouds from both sides now. The idea of the clouds, there's always dreaming. We dream about castles in the air and all that. Well, God's bigger than all that. Then we see, not only does God reveal himself in his majesty, or reveals his majesty, but notice his activity. He is brooding. He is working among the face of the deep, as Genesis 1:2 says. But notice in verse 5, he says, he who laid the foundations of the earth, so that it should not be moved forever. So it's God who has made the foundations. It is, and what you think about, we still don't know exactly what that means. We can't fathom what God has done. We can see a lot of the effects of what he's done, but who can even understand gravity? Who can understand the center of the earth? And we've had all kinds of imaginative stories, the journey to the center of the earth and all kinds of other things. But man has always been mesmerized by the depths of the earth as well as the height of the sky. It's just something that the height and length and breadth, as God talks about. And so we see that that word covered again is verse 6. He covered it with the deep as with a garment. There's the idea again. He brooded even upon the depths of the ocean, as well as the tops of the mountains. Notice the water stood above the mountains. Now, when did the water stand above the mountains? In the flood. So there's two things that we must realize about creation. In order to really understand creation, you must to give an account for the flood. And so that is of course why Genesis is fought so hard by people who reject God, is because they don't want to give an account of God. It had to be a local flood or whatever. No, God covered the mountains. That's your rebuke. In other words, when you said to stop and to recede, at your voice of your thunder, they hastened away. And so the waters went down. And by the way, that word hastened away, it means some of them, the waters flowed very quickly. One of the things that proves a flood, as well as water hastening away, is Monument Valley, out where they made all the cowboy movies. Remember where those big, tall mountains all that? I mean, there is no way that wind did that. And we were always taught that, the wind did all, but no, if you take a graph or your computer model, whatever, whenever the water runs, and it makes those swirls and everything else. So it's just those valleys show that there was a great deal of water that was running through soft rock. Remember, that rock had been under water for a year when it started receding. So the mountains were made, and of course God, and you say, what about Everest? Did they cover that? Well, Everest could have popped up even farther after, or who knows, whatever God did, he did it good, did it well. I don't know. I'd like to find out. I wish scientists would look at it from the biblical account. We're spending billions of dollars to look at Mars to see if there's life on it. And of course, even the British sent up their satellite to Mars, and they called it the Beagle. It's kind of interesting why they called it the Beagle. Why did they call it the Beagle? Because that was the name of the ship that, boy, how in the world could I forget it? Charles Darwin had. Why in the world could I was wanting to say Karl Marx. No, not Karl Marx, but Charles, I said, it's one of those things you get in your mind, you can't get it out. Okay, Charles Darwin had, and they named it the Beagle. And it's interesting how the British spend billions of dollars and they still want to believe in evolution. And yet we know that God designed all this. But we see the foundations of the earth and actually the foundations of the universe. I like what he says in verse, there again, let's go back. He went up over the mountains, went down into the valleys, to a place where he founded for them. Now notice, the waters now are controlled by him. You have set a boundary that they may not pass over. I am not worried about global flooding again. I am not worried about the seas rising, although we had a recent president that said he was going to stop all that because of his presidency, and it's worse now than it's ever been. But no, the waters are not going to rise, although I've said many times, it wouldn't be bad if it did rise and wipe out some of the liberal cities like New York and Philadelphia and no, I don't want that. But, it'd wipe out a lot more of that if it took those cities. But there again, and I don't want those cities because there are a lot of good people there. So, I'm just facetious. But he says, you have set a boundary that they may not pass over. Well, wait a minute, Pastor. What about Venice, Italy? Well, there are certain parts in the world. In fact, I could take you to Dauphin Island, Alabama, and you'll have before one hurricane, you'll have all these houses out on stilts on the western side. Then the next hurricane comes through, and there's nothing there except a few poles where those houses were on. And then the next hurricane will come on, and it will reshift the sand, and guess what? Those people will go up and build up there again until the next hurricane comes. Now, what happened there's something happening, and they've talked about the different problems that Venice has. But there's other places that where the water rises or whatever, and causeways are threatened. But the Netherlands, no, they caused their own problem. They tried to reclaim the oceans, and I guess they've done it pretty well, if you want to call it a problem. But they got to have a lot of guys with fingers ready to put in the dike or whatever. But really, that, if anything, that is evidence that the oceans aren't rising, because they would be having major problems now if the water was rising. So the Netherlands is a pretty good idea that it's been pretty stable for the last couple of 100 years, or whenever they started building those dikes. So we see that he set the boundaries, and there's no more flood. And notice in verses 10 through 13, the springs and the valleys, they give drink to the beasts of the field, the donkeys. Notice the details of his design. He designed all this, and he made it so that you have salt water in its boundaries, and you have fresh water that flows for the animals of the earth. And later on we'll see that he has oceanography, if you want to call it that, where we look at what he does with the seas. And just different worlds, a whole different environment for fresh water as opposed to salt water. And yet how that God keeps them apart. It's just amazing what he did there. And, so many of the animals on earth, including man, cannot live with salt water. And yet there are animals that can't live in fresh water. And so it's kind of interesting how that God did all that by design. And it could not have been by evolution. So notice the drink for the beasts, the donkeys quench their thirst, the birds of heaven have their home. I like that birds of the heavens, so the air. They sing among the branches, so you can tell this guy probably would have liked to have heard, well, he's heard it up in heaven, I'm sure. O Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the worlds thy hands have made. And he could sing right along with the modern author who talks about and feel the gentle breeze. He talks about the birds and the brooks and so forth. The earth is satisfied with her fruit, the fruit of your hands. So it's the earth who makes the fruit of the land. I like to go by those corn or those crops on the way to church in the spring. And now I talk to farmers around here. It's not knee high by the 4th of July. He said by the 4th of July it better be a lot higher than than knee high. But just how did it happen? And then of course we didn't have rain. And I've got a farmer friend that I'll talk to, and he says if we don't have rain within the next few days, then the first thing that goes are the hilltops. He says if the corn or whatever's on top of the hills, it turns white, then and you don't want it to keep going down. And that's things that you just learn from a farmer. And guess what? The next couple of days we got rain. So, I was every time I think about those type things now, talking to that farmer, his name is one of Al's friends named Jack, that it's so much fun to talk with him about that. And I was telling him the other day, I said, Jack, every time I see rain now I think about you, because he's the one that tells me about ears of corn. I never knew that every ear of corn, every row in an ear of corn is the number is always even numbers. And so you always have an even numbered rows of corn. And then those little silt things that really pester you when you try to eat, those are the things that take the water up to the top of the ear, and all those things that I didn't even think of, and he'll go through other things that I'm mesmerized by talking to these guys who know a whole lot about farming. And he farms about 4,000 acres, so he better know what he's doing. And so we see that he sustains life as well as the whole systems. And notice the systems that he talks about in verse 14. He causes the grass to grow for cattle. You're like one blade of grass. Think about the system of that one blade of grass with the chlorophyll and everything and the root systems and all that. And then the different varieties of grass and the textures and all those things. And that would be, what do we call that system? It's not botany. Is that botany? Okay, so then also the vegetation for the service of man. So even God designed it so that man could eat vegetation. Who would have, evolution just happened upon that? No. How could the evolution have thought that up? And so that he may bring forth food from the earth. So God made it that way. By the way, people say, they'll talk about the oldest profession. Well, the oldest profession is not bad. The oldest profession is gardening. So if you're a gardener, no wonder people like doing it. That's one of the original what man ever has done. But as, of course, farming, agrarian. The wine that makes glad the heart of man, oil that makes his face shine, bread which strengthens man's heart. How did all those systems of each one of those fruits and vegetables evolve? No way. Just think of all the different systems and all the textures and the nutrients and the calories and all those things that had to be built into each one of those things that we eat. And that's just the vegetation. The trees are full of sap. I like to use that verse with my friend named Jim Sapp. Are you a tree? But full of sap. But it's S-A-P-P is his name. He says, the trees of the Lord are full of sap. The cedars of Lebanon, which he has planted. Notice God planted those. You look at the prairie grass. Who planted that? God planted that prairie grass. And vegetation all over the earth. God planted it. Where the birds make their nests. And again, there we go. What do you call, what's the study of birds? Entomology is the study of aeriology. What is it? Okay, I forget what it is. But just the systems of birds. I mean, each one of these are ologies. Each one of them cover whole science departments in universities. The Audubon Society, all these, Audubon, John James Audubon. Okay, but there's an Audubon over in Germany, that's the highway, but Audubon. Okay, so he says, where the birds make their nest and the stork has her home in the fir trees. And how did God design it so that those storks deliver babies? I mean, that is really a fantastic design, isn't it? No, of course. But he says, the high hills are for wild goats, and the cliffs are the refuge for rock badgers. I mean, no matter where you go, whether you go up to the highest mountain, there's life. You go to the lowest. And those high, barren mountains, how can the goats even survive except that God has designed for them to be there? It's just amazing what God has done with each animal has a different design. And so I like that old joke that my kids would get sick because I tell it too many times, but the guy that says, look what God has done. If there's really a God, look at that little vine, and look at that big watermelon. And then look at that oak tree, and then look at that little acorn. And the guy was walking along with him, and all of a sudden an acorn fell off and hit him in the head and said, aren't you glad that wasn't a watermelon? So God has ways of designing things for man's good. And so, again, we see the hills. I mean, he's just going through all these biological and botanical and all the different systems, and just an aviary. What's it? Ornithology. Okay, there it is. What's that? Birds. Ornithology is birds, and the aviary is a bird sanctuary. So, okay, and all that. So that's just think of the terms just for birds. And then you have subsystems within the bird system and all those different things that are just systems upon systems upon systems. you have a blood system, but within your blood system you have cell systems, and just amazing how that God has made us. And so we see in verses 14 through 23 then, all these systems, the ecosystems, zoology, botany, biology, just you can go on and on with them. But then in verse 19, you see the timing. God is a God of system and timings. And we see that he appointed the moon for seasons. The sun knows it's going down. You make darkness, and it is night, in which all the beasts of the forest creep about. The young lions roar after their prey, and they seek food from God. When the sun rises, they go together and lie down in their dens. Now, aren't you glad that lions don't usually run around in the daytime? That's when man's supposed to run around. In the jungle, the mighty jungle, the lion sleeps tonight. No, he's got it wrong. It's in the daytime that the lion sleeps. Never thought about that, but that's, you heard that song all your life, but they got it turned around. But he lies down in their dens. Man goes out to work. God's designed him by the sweat of his brow, and to his labor until the evening. And of course, today with lights, of course, we have much more of a 24/7 cycle. But doctors tell us that there's a lot of problems working at night. That people that work during the daytime, and especially early risers, are usually, in general, much healthier than people that work at night. There's just something about that. And one of the things they're finding out is that if you have light, if you sleep in light, then that affects your eyesight. And a lot of people, why do so many of us have to wear glasses? Because of Thomas Edison, or whatever. Because we have a lot more problems with the eyes than they did back, before the lights. Now, they've done the studies about it. There again, we're just going through this. I'm giving you things that if you really want to look at that, I don't have all the documentation in front of me, but you got the smartphone. You can look at all that stuff yourself. But so the solar system affects the Earth. And of course, we know the tides and the moon, and even our body cycles and so forth that are affected by the moon, and so and moods and so forth. And so we see that in verses 14 through 23. And then we also see that God has power over life and death. Notice in verse 24, he says, "O Lord, how manifold," that means multifaceted. When you see the word manifold, it means multifaceted. "How multifaceted are your works. In wisdom you have made them all." There it is, underline that. You have made them all. Was it Harriot, James Harriot, that wrote "The Lord God made them all"? He was just mesmerized by being a veterinarian and how that God made animals. And he made probably a couple of $1 million off just the books he wrote about being a veterinarian in Scotland. But in wisdom, he made them all. The earth is full of your possessions. The great wide sea, now we're getting into oceanography, in which are innumerable teeming things. There's that covering again. He teemed, he brooded upon the face of the deep. You have animals out there, and you have all kinds of little animals that live on animals. You have parasites that have parasites. Just the teeming life upon life, even in the sea. Living things, both great and small. There are ships sail about, and there is the Leviathan. Now, was that a whale or was that a prehistoric animal? We don't know, but we see that term several times, especially in the book of Job. But whatever it was, and of course, if anybody that goes out in a little raft and sees a huge whale, I would call it, a Leviathan, especially if it spewed its water over me as I was breathing. It says, the ships sail about, and there is a Leviathan, which you have made to play there. I mean, Lord, you made your little playthings, the big whales. Scares me to death, but you've done it. They all wait. Notice that there's another term. They all wait for you. They wait for your blessings, that you may give them food in due season. Who gives the whale food? Who gives the lion food? Who gives you food? Aren't you glad? I don't know. I've met very few people, and there's only been one or two times in my life that I even thought about it as far as the next day. But I have never really had to pray, Lord, give me this day your daily bread, or I'm going to starve. Has anybody here done that? I mean, I've thought about it, especially with my family. We got caught in between churches and what I was going to do next, and we're on the road, and I got to feed these 6 people or 5 people, and what am I going to do? All the stores are closed, and I remember one time going into a convenience store and just having to spend all kinds of money just to feed the little boogers and back, but that was the only place that was open. But that's the only time I've ever really thought about that, and I thought, man, I've lived a privileged life. It just sneaked up on me, all of a sudden. Hey, wait a minute, I got to feed these guys. We're out there in the middle of nowhere. And but that's the only time I've ever had to really pray, is when I got caught flat-footed a couple of times. And my kids ate one meal a day. They started in the morning and they finished at night. So, so we see that, and that he may give them food in due season. There's another thing. Notice, they wait for you, due season, that is timing. What you give them, they gather in. You open your hand, and they are filled with good. Notice God who gives it from his hand. You hide your face, and they are troubled. Uh-oh, if God withdraws his blessings, we're dead. He says, you take away their breath, they die. Yeah, air and food, you're dead. You send forth your spirit, they are created. And you renew the face of the earth. Renew. Think about spring. Think about Mount St. Helens. Are things growing out there now? He renewed that total. Now, Evelyn doesn't even remember what, or doesn't. She might have heard of. You ever heard of Mount St. Helens, Evelyn? She's got her microphones on, but. No, the reason I'm asking that, of course, another generation, that was something that was phenomenal back, was 1980 something that happened. And planes couldn't fly. I mean, just lava was all over or smoke was all over, and lava, the planes couldn't fly into it because it would tear up the engines. And yet today, not only is that mountain full of vegetation, but guess what else is happening? Those, we've heard so much about petrification, and back when I was in school, it took millions of years for the petrified forest there in Arizona and out west to happen. Well, they have found that many of those, that matchstick looked like of trees, millions of trees that were wiped out when that lava came down. They got stuck in water. Many of them got stuck in water. And guess what? After about a generation ago now, they're petrified. Not petrified, but they are now petrified, and they see that it doesn't take millions of years, but a generation or two, and you could turn a wood, and a little ossify or whatever, into stone. It's just amazing. So even God's creation disproves evolution. Verse 31, may the glory of the Lord endure forever. So now we see not only creation and God's sovereignty, these things wait for you. You have power over life and death. I mean, everything depends on you. The air we breathe, the food we eat, the water we drink, everything depends on you. So he reveals himself by just creating needs in our lives, and he reveals his sovereignty. He reveals, it's appointed unto us wants to die. So he has power over life and death. Then we see, and as we finish up, this is a longer psalm. I'm taking too long, so we've got to finish. But the rest of the psalm, 33 through 35, notice it turns into praise. And he's talking about his royal splendor. He says, I will sing to the Lord as long as I live. I will sing praise to my God while I have my being. So he's seeing all this, and he is saying, praise the Lord for all he's doing. May my meditation be sweet to him, and I will be glad in the Lord. There's the idea of when, O Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder. And so when we think about God and who he is, it just we start realizing who just the great blessings that he gives us, and they through gates of splendor, and even books that have been written about God's revelation to us. And so we see that so it's to those who fear him, but then also God's going to take care of evil one day, and soon sinners are going to be consumed from the earth, and the wicked shall be no more. Wickedness shall be no more. And so what God can do, and there again, the power to bless is also the power to curse. And so people who tell me, oh, I could lay hands on somebody and heal them, okay, I want to see what you can do with somebody who, if I see an Ananias and Sapphira around, I might believe the other, because if you have the power, and that if you could raise people from the dead, then you also have the power, as Peter had, to either raise them from the dead or commit them to the Spirit. But so we see the judgment upon those who reject him. And then he finishes up again. Bless the Lord, oh my soul. And we say that's, everything I got. Bless the Lord. And sometimes when you're alone, or sometimes I'll come through here. And that's a good song to sing. Bless the Lord, oh my soul, and all that is within me. Sing it about several times. And just start thinking about God. Stayed upon Jehovah, hearts are fully blessed. Finding as he promised, full, perfect peace and rest. Okay, any questions or comments about what we looked at? It's a long psalm, but it sure is a good one. And